A world can collapse, not in firestorms or orbital bombardment, but in the quiet dread of daily survival. Imagine a hive city, its endless towers pressing against the clouds, its foundations drowned in the dark stink of some water. Now imagine that city under siege, not from afar, but from within its very arteries, every vent, every rusted corridor, every gate where orc claws batter against iron. This is where the story begins, not with grand campaigns plotted on star maps, but with the footsteps of ordinary souls trapped in the jaws of an invasion, the stench of Prometheum fires, the echo of distant gunfire, the shrill laughter of green-skinned marauders echoing through once familiar streets. To survive here is not merely to breathe, but to cling to a life that the galaxy has already decided to forget. And in the heart of that hive, every prayer whispered to the Emperor is swallowed by the roar of war. Before we begin our descent into this world, pause with us for a heartbeat. If you find value in these journeys through the forgotten corners of the Imperium, if you want more stories carved from steel, ash, and memory, then lend your support, like, share, and subscribe. It keeps the lights burning in this endless dark. Smoke rose before dawn, though the dawn itself never truly reached the lower tiers of the hive. The walls had held for weeks, their Gothic fortifications bristling with macro cannon and lost batteries, but against orcs walls are never eternal. The breach came not as a thunderclap, not with some glorious charge, but with the steady hammering of crude artillery, the ceaseless roar of greenskin machines grinding stone and steel into dust. By the time the warning klaxons screamed through the vox, the outer defenses had already buckled, and the flood of war had poured inward. For the citizens who had never seen the light of another world, this was the moment their sky became forever broken. The first reports told of manufactorum, workers dragged from their stations, their flesh torn apart in the shadow of conveyor belts that had once forged munitions for the Emperor's armies. Merchants abandoned their stalls, leaving silks and spices to burn in flames fed by Prometheum tanks ruptured under the crude axes of the invaders. The orcs did not conquer strategically. They conquered with laughter and hunger, their every movement a parody of war and a mockery of civilization. To the hive, their arrival was not merely an invasion, but the beginning of unmaking. Every gate, every plaza, every shrine reduced to rubble, not because it needed to be, but because the orcs demanded it. For those in the lower districts, survival was measured by the heartbeat. A mother pressed her child against the cold stone of a stairwell, whispering prayers to the Emperor, while the sound of boots and guttural roars echoed closer. Her neighbor, a man who had never touched a weapon, gripped a pipe in trembling hands, knowing it would bend against the first orc skull it met. Hablocks became fortresses overnight, barricaded with furniture and broken machinery. Yet nothing in their walls could match the brutal strength of green fists and jagged cleavers. Above them, the remnants of the planetary defense forces struggled to hold their line. The Astra Militarum units that remained in the Hive City were not the proud parade regiments that had once marched down its avenues, but ragged survivors dragged from battlefield to battlefield, now tasked with defending their own kin. They fought not with confidence but with grim necessity, lasguns hissing in the smoky streets as orcs surged forward. Yet for every orc felled, two more appeared, their crude banners swaying in the choking air, their guttural cries echoing off the cathedral-like walls of the city. The breach in the wall was more than physical, it was spiritual. In the grand spires, priests bellowed hymns through cracked vox grills, their voices straining to drown out the chaos below. Some shouted of redemption, urging the faithful to die as martyrs for Terra, while others screamed of damnation, claiming the Emperor's judgment had come at last. Between these conflicting sermons, the people of the Hive clung to whatever fragments of belief they could, clutching Aquila pendants, daubing their faces in ash, whispering psalms even as their blood slicked the stones. Faith, once unshaken, frayed with every scream that rose from the streets. In one sector, A munitions depot erupted in flames, sending a column of black smoke into the already darkened sky. The explosion rattled through the Hive's bones, shaking loose centuries of dust from gargoyles and buttresses. Orcs howled in delight, rushing into the inferno, as if fire were no deterrent. From the shadows, skittery detachments emerged, their augmetics gleaming in the firelight, unleashing disciplined volleys into the green tide. Their presence was a reminder that not all order had collapsed, that the machine god's servants still stalked the Hive, but even their precision was drowned in the tide of bodies, their bionics torn apart beneath rusted cleavers, as the orcs adapted to this new prey, and so the city became a maze of war, every street choked with smoke, every alley filled with the dead or the fleeing. Children were carried in bloodied arms past shrines that now burned, their statues toppled by crude orc engines. Servitors marched in their hundreds, their lobotomized bodies repurposed as living barricades, sent to hold avenues with bolters strapped to their arms. Their silence, their mechanical indifference, only deepened the horror for the citizens forced to hide behind them, watching as they were butchered without hesitation, their machine spirits extinguished in crude laughter. The breach widened, not merely in stone, but in memory. Those who survived the first wave already spoke of neighbors they had not seen since the morning, of districts swallowed entirely by the green tide, of names erased before they could even be mourned. The administratum clerks who had once tallied tithes now scribbled frantic lists of the missing, though many knew their data slates would be useless by dawn. Memory itself seemed fragile in the roar of invasion, each passing moment consuming not only lives, but the record of lives, until all that remained were whispers and the sound of gunfire. By the time night fell, the Hive city was no longer a fortress, but a wound. Flames bled from its walls, smoke poured from its veins, and the cries of its people mixed with the brutal song of orc warband. Families huddled in the dark, clutching one another while the walls shook with distant detonations. Some prayed louder, believing their voices might reach the Astronomicon itself. Others sat in silence, already believing themselves forgotten, for in that night, the truth became clear. The breach in the walls was the breach in their world, and nothing within those towers would ever be whole again. The walls had fallen, but the real horror began when the war seeped into the corridors. The Hive city was a labyrinth, a place where millions had once lived their entire lives without seeing the sun, where tunnels wound like veins through steel and stone. It was here, in the bowels of the city, that the orcs spread like infection. Their boots thundered through passageways too narrow for their bulk, their guttural laughter rolling like storm drums down stairwells, slick with condensation. There were no front lines anymore, only intersections where the next turn might reveal an enemy or a survivor. The Hive itself became a predator, and every echo felt like it belonged to something hunting you. The Vox systems screamed day and night, though their voices were as much a curse as a guide. Orders blared from rusted speakers, each contradicting the last. "Hold your positions," one barked, while another howled for immediate retreat. Astra Militarum officers shouted themselves hoarse, their commands lost in the endless feedback of damaged machinery. Administratum clerks, once the masters of tally and tithe, now stumbled through corridors with parchment and cracked data slates, their pens turned into the most desperate weapons imaginable. Some were caught between orc warbands and desperate civilians who demanded safe passage, their bodies discovered hours later, crushed beneath the green tide, messages unread, orders forever undelivered, in the hablocks. Silence became as dangerous as sound. Families who had thought to wait out the storm discovered the truth too late. Orcs were not deterred by locked doors or prayers. The beasts smashed through walls as though they were paper, dragging out screaming dwellers into corridors now painted red. Those who tried to remain unseen faced a worse fate, for silence drew the orcs in like scent. The greenskins would prowl entire levels, sniffing the air, their guttural mutters filling the void. To stay hidden was to gamble with a predator's patience. and patience was a game the orcs rarely lost. Each corridor became a battlefield of improvisation. Civilians armed themselves with anything they could wrench from their surroundings: metal rods, industrial cutters, lost tools meant for welding, not war. Entire hab floors fell into guerrilla warfare, striking from shadows before vanishing into maintenance shafts. Some fought not for victory, but for delay, buying seconds of survival for those who fled deeper into the hive. Others, stripped of hope, charged screaming into the orcs, clutching grenades salvaged from fallen guardsmen, detonating themselves in firestorms that turned the narrow halls into chambers of ash and bone. The shadows themselves betrayed the living. Generators flickered, casting light that stuttered along damp walls, so that every moment was filled with shifting shapes and imagined movement. Steam hissed through broken vents, masking the footsteps of the enemy until they were already upon you. The hive city groaned under its own weight, ancient structures cracking as orc engines pounded through levels never meant to bear such strain. Even the machine spirits seemed unsettled, doors refusing to open when commanded, lifts plunging into the abyss without warning. Too many. It felt as though the city itself wished to expel its people, shedding them as easily as the orcs tore through its arteries in those suffocating corridors. The Astra Militarum waged their own retreat. Squads withdrew step by step, their lasguns firing disciplined volleys that burned holes in the smoke. Yet the claustrophobic passages denied them maneuver, and their formations collapsed into knots of desperate soldiers, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the very citizens they had once kept at arm's length. Sergeants barked orders into the chaos, but the line between soldier and refugee blurred with each clash. It was no longer about defending territory. It was about buying time, every passage choked with corpses that slowed the next wave, just long enough for another pocket of life to slip away. In the lower reaches, water seeped ankle-deep, a stagnant flood filled with oil and blood. It was here that the orcs hunted with the most abandon, their hulking frames crashing through the darkness, their jagged cleavers scraping along the walls as if daring the hidden to reveal themselves. The smell of rot mixed with promethium fumes, creating an air so thick it burned the throat. Civilians huddled behind rusted grates, listening to the monsters snarl and laugh, praying to the Emperor for silence while clutching the relics of their families. Some whispered that even the Emperor's gaze could not reach this deep, that in these lightless arteries, only the greenskins reigned. The corridors echoed with rumors as much as gunfire. Stories spread of orcs carving trophies from the fallen, of entire hablevels silenced overnight, their inhabitants dragged screaming into the dark. Some claimed that gangs of Underhive scum had allied with the invaders, leading them through secret paths in exchange for survival. Others insisted that the Hive's own machine spirits had turned hostile, guiding the orcs while sealing doors on the faithful. Whether truth or madness, these whispers shaped the air itself, so that every step felt like a descent into something deeper than war, something that blurred survival with despair. By the second week, the Hive city was a corpse still twitching. Corridors once filled with the bustle of life were now graves, their walls scrawled with desperate prayers in blood and ash. The faithful painted the Aquila with shaking hands, only to see it defiled moments later by orc laughter. Vox channels hissed with nothing but static, the last coherent orders already lost to the tide. Every passageway became a mouth, and the city itself seemed to devour its people one by one. In the end, there was no safe corridor, no hidden refuge. The war had spread beyond the walls, beyond the spires, into the very marrow of the Hive, and in that marrow, the orcs hunted, relentless and laughing, their shadows stretching endlessly through the labyrinth. The people understood now that they did not live in a city under siege, they lived in a predator's lair, and every corner turned was a step deeper into its throat. The Hive had always risen like a forest of stone, its spires clawing at the heavens, each tower crowned with saints of marble and steel. But now those saints were blackened by flame, their outstretched arms catching the light of burning promethium that spilled like rivers down the facades. Orcs swarmed upward, their crude grapnels biting into stonework that had stood for millennia, their laughter booming even above the thunder of collapsing masonry. Engines belched, smoke thick enough to choke the sky, their contraptions wheezing and roaring as they scaled the Gothic towers, hammering against walls as though desecration itself was their form of worship. The city's spires, once a testament to imperial faith, became pyres where the greenskins carved their triumph in fire. The Astra Militarum counterattacked with the fury of desperation. Tanks rumbled down avenues no longer wide enough to support their weight, their treads crushing the dead of both sides beneath them. Basilisk guns thundered, their shells screaming into the orc tide, obliterating entire swaths of invaders in a single strike. But for every volley that struck true, collateral fire tore through hablocks where civilians cowered, walls splintering into showers of dust and bone. There was no precision here. The line between enemy and faithful blurred in the chaos, and the Emperor's defenders became executioners by necessity. In those moments, victory was indistinguishable from massacre. High above, the flames painted the sky in hues of crimson and ash. The air itself became molten, searing the lungs of those who dared climb to the upper platforms to man lascannons and missile turrets. Yet climb they did, men and women who had never seen war before, dragging ammunition by hand, loading guns with prayers whispered beneath their breath. They fought not because they believed survival possible, but because surrender meant annihilation. Every trigger pulled became an act of defiance. Every shell fired a plea to the Emperor that he still watched from his golden throne. The orcs came endlessly, their engines sputtering and belching fire as they surged higher. Smoke cloaked their advance, but their voices gave them away, raucous, guttural roars that turned the night into a chorus of madness. They dragged crude flamers fashioned from looted promethium tanks, spraying jets of liquid fire into windows where civilians had hidden. The spires burned from the outside and the inside alike, their intricate stonework cracking in the heat, statues of saints shattering as though even holy marble could not withstand the desecration. Those who survived the flames emerged half-blind and coughing, only to be cut down by cleavers waiting at the base of stairwells. Faith strained in those hours. Priests still thundered sermons from shattered pulpits, their robes scorched by falling cinders, urging the faithful to fight harder, to give their lives gladly. Some of the populace listened, clutching Aquillas to their chests as they charged into the fire, voices breaking into hymns as they disappeared into the smoke. Others turned away in silence, their faith fractured, lips moving with no words left to speak. For every believer who died screaming the Emperor's name, another died with doubt heavy in their eyes. The fire on the spires was not just the destruction of stone, it was the burning away of conviction itself. Amidst this chaos, the Astra Militarum pushed counterstrikes that bordered on suicidal. Chimeras roared through streets, already half collapsed, disgorging squads of guardsmen who fought room by room, level by level, clearing orc infestations with flamers of their own. Their efforts left entire districts unrecognizable, reduced to skeletal ruins that offered no shelter to either side. Yet in those moments of fury, when lost fire lit the smoke and explosions shook the ground, there was still a flicker of hope that perhaps, if enough orcs burned, the tide could be stemmed. It was a hope that cost lives measured in thousands. The spires themselves became battlegrounds of impossible scale. Orcs clambered over gargoyles and iron buttresses, tearing down centuries-old masonry as if it were clay, while guardsmen fired from shattered balconies, their muzzles glowing red with heat. In one sector, a cathedral spire collapsed entirely, its foundations undermined by crude orc engines. The tower fell like a felled tree, crushing hundreds beneath it, its bells tolling one last broken note as they plunged into the rubble. Survivors would later whisper that it sounded less like iron striking stone and more like a funeral knell for the entire Hive. Still, the defenders fought on, Amid the inferno, squads of Skittery marched in lockstep, their augmetics immune to the heat, their weapons cutting precision lines through the orc mobs. Mechanicus priests chanted Bin Herrick hymns, their voices echoing through the smoke like alien choirs, their eyes glowing with holy light as they called down bursts of machine-guided fire. Yet even these paragons of discipline found themselves faltering, their steel bodies cracking under the weight of crude orc hammers, their data feeds drowned in static as the greenskins smashed their augmetic limbs to ruin. The machine god's faithful bled circuits alongside the flesh of mortals. Above all, the sky itself became a furnace. Ash fell in waves, coating everything in a gray veil, while firestorms leaped from spire to spire, devouring whole districts in minutes. Vox transmissions dissolved into panicked screams before cutting out entirely, and the survivors spoke only in fragments, their words lost beneath the roar of burning towers. To look upward was to see not the heavens, not Terra's distant light, but a canopy of smoke, lit by fire in inversion of the Emperor's promise, as though the very firmament had been claimed by the greenskin horde. By the end of the third night, the Hive city was unrecognizable. Its proud silhouette was broken, its spires reduced to jagged stumps glowing red in the heat. The orcs, tireless and gleeful, danced upon the ruins, their shadows cast like giants across the burning skyline. The Astra Militarum, bloodied and diminished, clung to what districts they could still hold, their faith tested beyond endurance. For every shell they fired, 100 prayers went unanswered, and as the smoke thickened, as the fires raged without end, the question grew heavier in every heart. Had the Emperor already turned his gaze away? The fires had not yet gone out when the whispers began. At first, they were dismissed as madness, born of smoke and fear, the ramblings of civilians who had seen too much. But soon, the pattern became undeniable. There were places in the Hive that no one could find again, streets where entire families had lived, manufactorums that had rung with the sound of hammers, shrines where incense had burned for centuries gone, not reduced to rubble, not consumed by fire, but gone, as though the city itself had swallowed them. Refugees, stumbling through the chaos, found their own memories unraveling, unable to recall the path that had once led them home. Vox maps flickered with dead zones, routes that ended abruptly in blank static, as if the machine spirits themselves had forgotten what had been there. Administratum. Clerks tried to keep order in their records, but their data slates betrayed them. Entries vanished mid-sentence, whole districts marked simply with empty space where once there had been names. Cartographers who attempted to redraw the Hive's schematics found that their ink would smear or their parchment tear when they tried to mark certain sectors, as though even the tools of record resisted remembering. Some declared it superstition, the natural collapse of archives under duress. Others whispered that the orcs had brought more than destruction, that they had torn holes in memory itself, leaving not ruins but absence. Among the survivors, rumor carried more weight than fact. In the shadows of burned spires, huddled groups spoke of entire blocks disappearing overnight, their occupants erased so completely that no one could remember their faces. Mothers claimed their children had been taken not by orc blades, but by the silence itself, names slipping from their tongues like smoke. Priests of the Ecclesiarchy, their robes scorched and torn, argued over whether this was heresy or judgment. Some declared it the Emperor's will, a cleansing of the unworthy from his sight. Others whispered darker truths, that chaos itself might be feeding upon the Hive, using the orcs as crude instruments while it devoured memory whole. Even the soldiers felt the weight of forgetting. Patrols returned from missions, unable to recount where they had fought, their after-action reports riddled with blanks. One squad swore they had defended a great square crowned with a statue of Saint Dravanius, yet no such square could be found, and no record of the saint's likeness existed in the archives. Another unit spoke of a manufactorum where they had fought until their ammunition ran dry, only to find no trace of it when they attempted to return. The Hive was collapsing not only in stone, but in certainty. Its very existence unthreatening before their eyes. The orcs did not notice, or perhaps they reveled in it. To them, absence was simply more space to desecrate. They built crude idols in the voids where districts had been, hammering together iron effigies that leered over the ruins. Some survivors swore these idols pulsed faintly, their shadows longer than they should have been, as though they marked not territory but wounds in reality itself. Whether truth or delirium, such sights deepened the conviction that the Hive was not merely dying, but being devoured by something greater than fire. Rumor grew heavier than rubble. Citizens refused to speak the names of the missing districts, believing that to do so was to invite the same erasure upon themselves. Some began to paint their names in blood across the walls, desperate to anchor themselves in memory. Others carved their family lineages into stone, weeping as they worked, as if their own existence might otherwise fade into blankness. These desperate acts gave the Hive an atmosphere more haunted than ruined. Corridors lined not only with corpses, but with frantic attempts to prove that lives had once been there. The Mechanicus searched for answers in the machine spirits. They tore open cogitators, coaxing them with incense and sacred oils, demanding that they reveal the lost records. Yet even their prayers faltered. Data vanished mid-chant, binary hymns stuttering into static, before collapsing altogether. When Magos declared that the memory cores themselves were corroding, not by age or fire, but by something outside comprehension. His words were silenced quickly, for they hinted at heresy. But the silence did not erase the fear that spread among his attendants. If even the machine spirits could forget, then what hope did flesh and blood have of remembrance? By the third week, maps of the Hive had become meaningless. Command posts tried to plot defenses, only to find their charts riddled with voids. Vox operators shouted coordinates that no longer existed, sending reinforcements to blank spaces where only silence waited. Every failed order, every misstep, every squad lost to absence deepened the sense that the city was cursed. The war against the orcs was no longer only about survival. It had become a war against forgetting itself. A struggle to hold on to the idea that the Hive had ever existed at all. Some survivors clung to faith, declaring that the Emperor remembered even when mortals could not, that he inscribed every name in his eternal ledger. Others began to doubt even this, whispering that if the Emperor's light truly reached them, the Hive would not be dissolving into silence. Those doubts spread like infection, eroding morale faster than any orc blade. Whole platoons abandoned their posts, claiming there was nothing left to defend. Their desertion only deepened the void, for their absence too became part of the forgetting. And yet, even in this unraveling, the city still breathed. Fires still burned, gunfire still echoed, survivors still staggered through the ruins, clinging to fragments of memory. But each day, the Hive seemed less like a city and more like a dream fading at dawn. Its streets lost their names, its shrines lost their saints, its people lost their certainty of ever having lived there. The orcs raged and laughed, the soldiers fought and bled, but beneath it all was the greater truth. The Hive was not merely falling, it was being erased. When the last spires collapsed and the final Vox voices fell silent, the Hive ceased to exist in more than stone. Its ruins smoldered beneath a sky veined with ash, yet for those beyond its walls, it was already gone. Administratum scribes erased its name from their ledgers, their styluses hesitating only briefly before scratching out a designation that had endured for centuries. Cartographers redrew their charts without its outline, leaving only empty space where once a continent-spanning city had stood. Officially, it had never been there at all. The Imperium does not mourn its dead cities, it buries them beneath silence. And yet, silence is not emptiness, it is an echo. The echo spread first in rumor, carried by survivors who staggered into nearby systems. They spoke in broken voices of streets that vanished into void, of families erased not by fire or blade, but by something heavier. something that pulled memory itself into its maw. Some claimed the orcs had devoured more than flesh, that their crude laughter carried power to unmake what it touched. Others muttered of darker truths, of demonic hunger gnawing through the cracks of war, using the greenskins as tools of entropy. Most listeners dismissed them as lunatics, too far gone in shock. Yet the rumors spread all the same, because there was a weight to them, a gravity of fear that no dismissal could erase. In the halls of the Ecclesiarchy, sermons wrestled with the Hive's fate. Some priests declared the city a holy sacrifice, its ruin a tithe paid to buy the survival of other worlds. They called it a noble martyrdom, proof that the Emperor's light demanded blood to shield his realm. But others whispered that the Hive had been forsaken, that the Emperor's gaze had turned away long before its fall, that its death was not salvation but abandonment. These words never reached pulpits, but they smoldered in private confessionals, spreading doubt among those whose faith had been iron only weeks before. The Astra Militarum, too, carried the echo. Regiments pulled from the wreckage bore scars not only of the body, but of memory. Soldiers woke in their cots, screaming names they could no longer recall, clutching tokens from families whose faces they could not describe. Their commanders drafted reports of campaigns fought in streets that no longer appeared on any chart, their words redacted until the parchment itself was left nearly blank. Whole units were struck from record, not for dishonor, but for absence, as though their existence had been carried away with the Hive itself. And still the orcs remained. Not in the ruins, they had already moved on, seeking the next war, the next fire, the next world to desecrate. But their presence lingered in the stories, in the nightmares, in the sense that something of them had been left behind. Survivors spoke of laughter echoing through static, of green shadows flitting across the walls of distant settlements, of crude glyphs scrawled on walls that had never known orc hands. Whether true or not, the impression was the same. Orcs did not leave behind mere rubble. They left infestation, a sickness of memory and fear that spread long after their departure. The Mechanicus sought to explain what had been lost, but even their logic faltered. Data crypts brought from the Hive disintegrated in their hands, their memory coils dissolving into static. Magi declared it was corruption, the natural decay of unstable archives. Yet whispers among their own ranks told of something else, that when a city is devoured, the very machine spirits themselves are unmade, their essence scattered into the void. No decree confirmed such heresy, but in the silence between prayers, many believed it, and so the echo grew. Not a single world, not a single ruin, but a wound in the galaxy itself. Pilgrims passing near the dead system reported unease, an ache in their hearts that deepened with every hour spent in its void. Navigators spoke of warp currents that twisted unnaturally around the star, pulling ships toward the husk of what had once been. Some captains avoided the route entirely, claiming the silence of the Hive was more dangerous than the roar of orc guns. Others took it as warning that if the galaxy could forget one Hive, it could forget countless more, and that perhaps humanity's dominion was already fading faster than it could be rebuilt. What remained was neither victory nor survival, but a haunting silence. The Imperium moved on, as it always does, its endless wars demanding fresh blood and new defenses. Yet in the silence, the Hive persisted not in records, not in charts, but in the whispered dread of those who remembered enough to know they had forgotten more. It became a curse, a cautionary tale, a shadow lurking behind the next orc invasion or the next rebellion. And in that shadow, the question lingered: what is more final, death or erasure? For those who lived through it, the answer was clear. Death leaves bodies, ruins, names carved in stone. Erasure leaves nothing but echo, and an echo that never fades becomes heavier than memory. The Hive may have vanished, struck from records and swallowed by war, but in the silence it left behind, it endured as something greater than ruin. Not a city, not even a world, a wound, a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, It is not only flesh and stone that can be consumed, but history itself. And so, the Hive lives on not in light, not in faith, not in victory, but in the silence of what no longer is.